Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining our program. We will begin shortly. ASIS International presents 4 tips to drive organizational resilience. Hello and thank you for joining. I'm Raquel Allen, Learning Program Manager at ASIS and today's host. We have some great information ahead, but first, a few housekeeping items. ASIS International acknowledges and thanks Everbridge for sponsoring today's webinar. Everbridge provides enterprise software applications that automate and accelerate organizations' operational response to critical events, such as active shooter situations, terrorist attacks, or severe weather conditions, as well as critical business events, including IT outages, cyber attacks, or supply chain operations. Everbridge has helped manage critical events for 5,600 plus customers globally, reaching more than 700 million people in over 200 countries, reservations, and territories. For more information, visit everbridge.com. Centered on your screen are the presentation slides. To the left of the slides, you'll find the media player where you should see today's presenter with his biography directly below. Under the presentation slides is the Q&A box. If you have a question during the presentation, type it there and we'll address it during Q&A at the end as time permits. To the right of the slides, you'll find webinar materials and resources, including today's presentation slides, as well as other links and resources you may find useful. Along the top and bottom of your screen are icons and images to access additional tools and information, including ASIS member resources and current learning programs. Hover your mouse over each to explore more. Should you experience any sound or audio disruption during the program, please refresh your browser. If additional help or support is needed, click the question mark icon at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the webinar, you will be redirected to an evaluation. Your feedback helps determine future programming, and your input is appreciated. CPE information. Completion of this webinar is eligible for 1 CPE credit. CPE credit will be updated directly into your user profile within 48 hours after the program's conclusion. Self-reporting is not required. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be made available on demand within 48 hours. Thank you again for joining today's webinar, 4 tips to drive organizational resilience. I'd now like to welcome and introduce our presenter, Eric Chetwynd, Senior Solution Marketing Director at Everbridge. Eric brings more than 20 years of experience creating and leading innovative software solutions to market. Prior to working for Everbridge, Eric led go-to-market strategies and solution delivery at a number of mission-driven technology organizations. Eric brings a unique global perspective, having worked closely with diverse teams worldwide to develop patient-centric solutions that address the complexities of today's healthcare landscape. He regularly speaks at educational conferences and organizational meetings and has been a featured presenter at HIMSS, Becker's, CMSA, NTOCC, Society of Actuaries, National Association of Healthcare Services, and IAHSS. Again, Eric's full bio is available in the speaker biography module, again to the left of the presentation slides, just below the media player. Hello, Eric. Thanks so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Raquel, and thanks for that intro. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your summer day to join us to talk about this really important topic, at least important to us, and hopefully you'll gain some insights as we go through today's presentation. So we're going to talk a little bit about driving organizational resilience, and maybe just to set the stage a little bit, as we think about the past couple of years, you know, the world really has changed, right? Obviously, I'm sure everyone in the audience, both you and your organization, has been impacted by COVID-19, which had severe impacts across all of our organizations. But that's really not the only thing that has changed over the past couple of years. We've seen an increase in severe weather events across the globe. So there's been a 40% rise in weather-related events since 2019. Cyber attacks are increasing as well. Something over 60% of companies suffered ransomware attacks during 2020. We've seen the rise in civil unrest as also impacting organizations across the globe. In North America, for example, in 2020, we had the George Floyd protests in 140 cities, which cost something north of $1 billion in insured losses. Supply chain disruption, which certainly started during COVID-19, but unfortunately we all continue to experience today, not only at our organizations or with our vendor relationships, but also, frankly, in our personal lives. And while all this is going on in the background, we've all moved to this sort of hyper workforce type model where really IT organizations are now pressured to achieve digital transformation kind of at speed. So everything is online all the time. I'm sure many of you in the audience are working out of remote locations as we speak. And so that has put a lot of pressure on organizations around the globe. So with that sort of backdrop, you know, this idea of organizational resilience, business resilience, enterprise resilience, there's a lot of terms for it, but it really has become a primary key initiative in a lot of organizations, enterprises across the globe, right? We see evidence of CEOs starting to put it on their list. So maybe pre-COVID, organizational resilience might have been thought of as a tier sort of maybe 15, 16 type priority item. Now we're really starting to see it in the top 5 priority items for many organizations because of the impact of the past couple of years. And when we look at that, when we look at organizational resilience and we talk about what are we really talking about? You know, organizational resilience, you know, there's multiple definitions, but one we like to think about is it's really the ability to identify, prepare for, and resolve disruptions and risks that may impact your organization, right? Allowing you to protect your people, your facilities, your operations, et cetera, and even your reputation in the marketplace. Often, what we hear from customers as we work with them to implement organizational resilience on their journey, we often hear things about, you know, can we reduce operational interruptions, obviously, maintain employee productivity during large-scale events, avoid property damage and loss, depending on the type of organization that you have. Increasingly now, you know, head off supply chain interruption. How do we keep our supply chain operating at efficiency? So all of these come together under sort of this definition of operational resilience. And really, you know, at the crux of it, we like to think at a very simple level that, you know, events that can impact your organization, really the goal is to be able to identify and mitigate those events early. The earlier that you can do that, the more time and options you have from a response perspective to keep those events, to minimize the impact of those events on your organization. So we talk about that. Why is it hard, right? And I'm sure many of you in the audience, you know, have to work around this on a daily basis. If you think about some of the typical events that, and this is certainly not a complete list, that we see, you know, things like severe weather, man-made disaster, supply chain disruption we just talked about, but also on the digital side, right, as we start to think about events within our organization that can impact us, such as IT system failures or outside cyber attacks, right? We see common trends across organizations around where it becomes difficult to manage these types of events and to mitigate them. One is, you know, a lack of insight, a difficult time trying to understand the events that are or may impact your organization in real time. Disparate teams and processes. We often see that, you know, things within a team might work well. If it's within security, maybe security activates really well, but we might want a cross-organizational response, or we might struggle with it's a cross-global type response where we need teams in different regions, for example, to be able to respond appropriately. And that's very difficult. Those teams often have different processes, different tool sets, different communication modalities, and that makes it very hard and kind of leads to this idea of also ineffective communication that's reliable during critical events. So as we think about how we can streamline these, you know, at a high level, these are some of the things that that we often talk to customers about. The first sort of area to think about from an organizational resilience perspective is the ability to know early that something is happening, right? The ability to identify events that may impact your organization. So Many organizations on their journey towards organizational resilience may start off with this, the idea of, we have news feeds coming in, we're watching the weather, we may be monitoring social media, for example, right? But to be able to distill those down into things that actually impact your organization, and understand the potential threat that they bring to your organization, can be very challenging to do that manually across an organization. And so what you really need is sort of a unified situational view of what's happening and is either impacting or is expected to impact your organization, so you can take appropriate countermeasures. The next step is obviously responding, right? Again, we often find that teams have disparate systems, processes, and tool sets. So as an event hits an organization, we often see that it becomes difficult for those teams to coordinate in a unified response. And so what we often talk to customers about is how do we bring that governance together? How do we bring those systems together so that those teams respond appropriately across teams? And then secondarily, how do we automate that response, right? Where are there opportunities? And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through here. And then the third area is really improvement. And so, again, this is another challenging area, especially if you've not digitized or have a number of systems that talk together, for example, to help you respond, because now you're manually gathering evidence post-event to understand, actually, frankly, both during an event, reporting up to stakeholders, for example, as well as post-event, where you have improvement opportunities and how you're actually impacting the overall risk posture of your organization. So these are three areas that we often work with customers on. Let's take a little bit of a deep dive into each of them. So in sort of the how do we know early, right? The first thing I would say is that many organizations often think about events within the infrastructure of their organization, right? So sort of within the four walls of your organization, although that may be a virtual four walls these days, right? Those have traditionally included things like fire, hazmat incidents, active assailant coming into a facility, theft, could be internal IT system failure. But I think as we've looked back over the past couple of years, what many customers have experienced is this idea of additional events that impact our organization that are more broad, right? So weather is one that many of you may be preparing for or work on a regular basis. But certainly civil unrest is one that I think has come up over the past couple of years that may be impacting your city, your county, or your state, depending on where you're located. But you may not have traditionally thought of as something you need to take a mitigation approach towards. Utility disruption, transportation disruption, all of those really reach out more broadly. And as we go even further and think about things like COVID, which is a global pandemic, which has impacted not only your organizations, but also all of our vendors and supply chains, et cetera, we need to really think more broadly around what events could potentially impact our organization and prepare for those. So give you a couple quick examples and some things to think about. I'll take a physical event first. As we look back, flooding in Europe has been happening more frequently lately. And in this case, this is an example of flooding in Northern Europe. And as you start to think about the things that your organization would want to understand if you had operations or people in Northern Europe during the flooding, you'd want to understand, obviously, where is the flooding located, right? But more importantly, is it located in places which would impact, for example, a facility that you have, right? Maybe you have an operations center, or maybe you have a manufacturing or a distribution center or something along those lines. Is it impacting those areas, right? Do you have employees in the area who are now going to be unable to get to work? And what is that? What would that mitigation strategy look like? Do you have traveling employees who might be in Europe? Maybe you have a sales team or a field services team that is actually in Europe, and you don't have physical, you don't have buildings on the ground, for example, but your people might be impacted still. And so how do you extend that organizational resilience and that duty of care to those people while they're also in the field? And then, of course, your vendors, right? Again, if you're operating in this region, how does it impact supply chains? As you can see here from the photos, right? The flooding brought down a lot of bridges. And so significant impact to supply chains and rerouting, et cetera, that might have to happen on the physical side. So those are some of the things to think about from a physical event perspective. As we think about internal, another example here might be a digital event, right? So as we think about services going down, a service failure, for example, you need to obviously understand which services are impacted, right? So from an IT perspective, how do I quickly understand that? But even beyond that, all of our services, digital services, are interrelated these days, right? So it may be that a service is down, but really part of the challenge would be, what is the root cause of that system failure or that service failure? And it may be a service way downstream. And how do you quickly identify that? And once you've identified that area, you need to bring the right teams to respond, right? It might be understanding, for example, we know that something over 70% of system downtime issues are caused by recent changes deployed into an IT environment. So how do you quickly get that understanding of, what things were changed in the last 24 hours, for example? Is that the root cause? So again, how do we bring that all together in a series and then provide that in a way where, in this case, the IT team, maybe in the previous case, it might be a combination of operations and security. How do we provide that situational awareness across these types of events so that we can respond in a unified manner and really mitigate them appropriately? And with that, I'm going to turn over to Raquel for a moment to do our first polling question.
All right. Thanks so much, Eric. So to our audience, let's take a quick moment here and make the selection that best corresponds with your experience. So how does your organization primarily find out about risk events or threats today? Fully reliant upon inbound communication from external sources such as TV, radio, social media, employees, et cetera. Regional or local employees with a protocol to report in. Free data feeds using keywords such as Google Alerts or Twitter. Purchase data feeds that target locations and specific interests, such as weather, fire, earthquakes, or risk data from public and private sources integrated into a unified critical event management system and available in real time. So again, take just a moment and select one of the responses to the following. How does your organization primarily find out about risk event threats today? All right, so again, I'm going to leave it open for just a few more seconds. We have about 30% of our attendees having responded. So again, how does your organization primarily find out about risk events or threats today? Fully reliant upon inbound communications from external sources, regional or local employees with a protocol to report in, free data feeds using keywords, purchase data feeds that target locations and specific interests, or risk data from public and private sources integrated into a unified critical event management system and available in real time. So we're going to leave that up for another 5 seconds. About 60% of you have responded, so we really love your feedback here. So simply select the option that best corresponds with your organization's practices. And we're going to leave that up for another 5, 4, 3. Come on, everyone, get those responses in. 2, and 1. All right, Eric, the big reveal. What do you think?
All right. No, this is great. And first of all, thank you everyone who did reply. And very interesting. I think to see that, and not surprising to see that many people may be on one side of the scale or the other. I think, we often find with our customers, and I think this kind of highlights it too, that this really is a journey that you take to get to organizational resilience, and certainly understanding and knowing it is one of those key areas, kind of that know earlier. So interesting results. Thank you everyone for replying. All right, let's jump on. So we've talked a little bit about identifying threats and risks. And again, based on your feedback, sharing some of the ideas of how you do that today. Really the next step is, how do we respond once we've identified a risk or a threat to the organization? that may impact our resilience. And again, as we work with customers on their journey, we often think about it within teams, right? So I've just given some examples here, right? It might be the security team responding, or our HR people team, or digital or operations, right? And what we really find as we have conversations is that when these events happen, they really impact across all teams. And so what that really means is you need all teams working together to manage and mitigate these types of events. Let me just give you a quick example. So, take COVID when the pandemic hit, right? That event, which was a long event for all of us, but that event started off with, personnel, people, HR teams starting to think about, we need to send people home. What do we need to do around, health and wellness checks, for example, with our people? What about vaccinations? All that stuff really started in many organizations on sort of the HR side of the house. But it quickly became a digital event in the sense that as people went home, we had to scale on our digital transformation needs, right? So many organizations went from an organization where maybe 10 or 15% of the workforce was remote or traveling or whatever on a regular basis to where 100% of everybody was, right? So that, from a digital scaling perspective, is a very different challenge. Obviously, that impacted operations, right? As we started to think about how do we keep everybody productive in providing either the services or products or whatever it may be that we're providing to the marketplace. And then lastly, is in this particular case, as folks started coming back to the office or back to your location sites, often we saw security folks not only thinking about the security situation, but what is working together to understand the health and wellness situation. Do we have to do social distancing? Do we have to set up different configurations within the office? A lot of our people are remote. How does that work? And this pattern, while it may sound unique for COVID, really does also exist in many other of these large-scale events. So civil unrest may start in security, thinking about how do we protect our facilities? But we may also bring in our HR teams to tell people to stay home, not come to those locations. We may be thinking about rerouting operations and supply chains and digital and et cetera. And so as you start to go through this process, you often find that really these types of events, while maybe one team may take the lead in responding, we often find that it really takes a cross-functional response to be able to mitigate them. And here are some questions that we often talk about with customers as we think about that response coordination across teams, right? One is, what plans do you have in place today? Which hazards, right, or risk events do you actually have plans in place for? And obviously that's going to vary based on your organization and your location and the things that happen in your area. And then the second piece is, is it managed digitally, right? We often find, again, depending on where you are in your journey, that folks may have several plans in place, but they may be sitting in binders. Makes it difficult to access, update, all that kind of capability. Second really question here is, do you have technologies in those events which really enable your teams to collaborate in real time, share information in a way that provides that situational awareness so that we're all responding together kind of on the same page during an event that impacts the organization? And then the third area is really, are your systems, particularly communication and collaboration systems, are they reliable? Are they resilient? So for example, if do you have multiple communication methods, for example, should one line of communication go out? Do you have an alternate line of communication to be able to coordinate those response teams? Do you have reliable ways to reach the people who may be impacted, et cetera? And then are those aligned with whatever your regulatory compliance is and standards may be for your business is another key area that we often talk about with customers. So let's talk a little bit about about automation and communication. When we think about not just digitally sharing plans, for example, the next level really, or the next step is how do you automate that, right? So for example, can you automatically identify the right responders based on the event and get those teams collaborating in real time automatically? Or is it more of a manual process that you have to follow to do that identification? Are you able to respond not only with your people, but actually your digital and physical system? So, often security may have some of this, right? It may be access control and cameras and badging, et cetera. But depending on your organization, the type of operations you have, this can be any sort of digital or physical system. And how do you bring them in and automate that response as part of your response process? And then again, I mentioned communications. How do you provide multimodal communication methods across both your responder teams and your those people who may be impacted and stakeholders to ensure that messages, even in the most critical events, are still being delivered, right? And tying those into those multimodals. The more communication methods that you have, the more likely that message is to get through. So that's sort of on the response side. The last piece I want to talk about, and it really does tie a little bit into this idea of how much of this you can digitize, is measuring performance, right? So both during an event, what do you have in place to keep folks informed about where you are in the process? So particularly large scale events, right? We may have senior management teams that are very interested in what's going on. How do we provide that information without just doing phone calls on a regular basis or sending an email update, et cetera? Do you have those tools in place? Do you have logging so that you can go back post-event and do analysis about, what worked and what didn't work, right? And you may even, as I mentioned earlier, have regulatory compliance issues that you need to manage here. And do you have that audit logging in place? Or is it, again, more manual processes that you have placed for those components? And then lastly, and really an area that I know we're working with a number of customers on, is this idea of, how do we take those past performance and understand the overall risk posture of your organization, right? So based on your performance and the risk events and threats that really present themselves and have presented themselves historically, how do you then start to correlate that into an idea of, here's risk posture, here's maybe new events that we need to plan for, here's where we have some areas of development, and gain that sort of improvement picture over time. And with that, we have one more polling question here. So Raquel, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thanks again, Eric. All right, and to our audience, our second polling question of the afternoon, please respond to the following. How do you typically locate the appropriate response team members during a critical event? Again, how do you typically locate the appropriate response team members during a critical event? Manual process to reach response teams using contact information on file. Iterative process to review and update contact information regularly. Access separate systems for location, skills, and schedules, and manually match information. Integrated systems with information about skills and locations, but not schedules. Or automated outreach based on predetermined teams, on-call schedules, and skills. So again, let's take just a moment and respond to the following question. How do you typically locate the appropriate response team members during a critical event? So just select the radio button beside which answer best corresponds with your current organization's practices. And again, how do you typically locate the appropriate response team members during a critical event? So we have about 45% of our audience members having answered. So everyone, please take just a moment to respond. How do you typically locate the appropriate response team members during a critical event? Manual process to reach response team members using contact information on file. Iterative process to review and update contact information regularly. Access separate systems for locations, skills, and schedules, and manually match information. Integrated systems with information about skills and locations, but not schedules. Or lastly, automated outreach based on predetermined teams, on-call schedules, and skills. So with that, we have about 58%. So let's leave it up for another 5, 4, 3, 2, and all of the last minute responders, thank you for selecting your answer. And now the big reveal. Eric, back to you.
Great. Well, and thank you again for providing your responses here. I think, interestingly enough, this really tightly correlates to what we talked about the earlier polling question. And I think it really highlights that it looks like those of you in the audience, again, a number of you have systems in place, which is fantastic. Again, on the journey here, that having systems in place is really key. And then it sounds like a number of you are kind of starting on that path, and maybe there's opportunity to progress further along and start to automate and digitize many of these processes, which would improve organizational resilience. So fantastic. Thank you all for responding. I thought I'd take a minute here, sort of in this next section, and we've been talking about sort of know, respond, improve, and the ideas behind that. But I wanted to give kind of an example of this in action. And so I picked an event here. We have a civil protest, right? And in this case, the event itself is kind of coming in through our security team, right? And so our security team identifies that there's a planned civil protest. And what you'd ideally like to have here is immediately be able to understand for that civil protest, is it near a facility, for example, whether it's manufacturing, retail, whatever the facility might be, or near a location where we have workers that could be impacted, right? And then with that knowledge, how do we drive our process and make a decision? So in this case, we've chosen the decision that security decides they're going to secure the impacted locations. They're basically going to lock them down during the protest in order to mitigate things like theft and damage, et cetera. Now, at the same time that this is going on, and this is another thing that really we've seen a lot more of over the past couple of years, is there's another series of events happening. So in this case, we have a malware attack that's happening where our IT team has picked that up. They need to obviously identify which services, the root cause, et cetera, isolate that, mitigate that malware attack to keep the digital systems, keep our IT systems up and running. So in both of these examples here, what you see is really kind of team-based response. But what I wanted to highlight is, in fact, both of these have impacts on the organization on the whole business. And so how do you start to bring in the rest of the organization to respond? So for example, in the case of shutting down those locations, if they're retail locations, in this particular example, we might want to notify staff of the closure. We might want to provide alternate work shifts at other locations that are staying open. And that really can have an impact on migrating our staff while protecting them at the same time. We might want to notify customers. Operations might reach out through the marketing group and say, hey, we got to notify customers about these closures, provide alternate sites to receive services. And then we might have supplies coming in. Let's say it's a food retailer. Maybe there's a daily shipment of supplies. How do we reroute those in real time to avoid them coming into the civil protest area, but also mitigate our cost infrastructure? So again, this is a quick example of really, bringing all the teams together to respond more at an organizational level rather than just at a, within a team silo level to be able to flex as these events happen. Now, in that particular example, which is very, more of a business-based example, we actually worked with, in this case, this is Forrester, who interviewed a number of customers who use platforms to try and mitigate these types of events. And based on those customers, they came back with sort of these 4 key areas, not the only ones, but I just listed 4 here, that they often see reduction in, right? So, business interruption, which we just talked about, keeping your services up and running, keeping your ability to deliver product up and running is very key. Lost employee productivity. In our example here, we reroute staff to other locations. It might also be something like maybe it's a call center and we reroute calls to a different call center while that call center is being impacted, or other operations where you have other procedures for rerouting and maintaining productivity. Property damage, here where we have retail locations being mentioned, right? There might be risk of that property damage, locking them down, securing those sites can mitigate that potential for property damage. And then of course, with the malware attack, or it could be ransomware or cyber, all those types of events, reducing that IT downtime, it can be pretty significant to keeping the operations up and running. And so these are based on feedback from those customers, and what they saw in this particular case was an over $8 million savings impact with over 3 years from being able to better operationalize and that organizational resilience and mitigate those events more quickly. All right. And with that, those are the materials I prepared today, but I think, Raquel, we might have some time, hopefully, try to leave some time for questions in case folks have them.
We absolutely do have time for questions. So before we begin, I would like to just remind our audience to take this opportunity to ask Eric your questions directly. Again, the Q&A box is to the right of the presentation slides, just below the speaker biography module. Type your questions there, and we will address it as time permits. All right, our first question. How do you overcome communication outages that might occur during a hurricane or other climate debilitating events? I agree that having multiple methods of communications is critical, but what best practices can you share?
Yeah, really great and important question. And so, obviously you've already highlighted having multiple channels to communicate with folks is key. And so is one step, right, to this concept. So that could be, as we think of electronic communication, texting, phone calls, it could be overhead, speakers. It could be, it could be, not to go back to old times, but it could be pagers. It could be, right. So thinking about the various electronic methods that you have to reach people is certainly the first key. But the second key, I think, is really thinking about, not just a sort of fire and forget messaging methodology, right? You need the ability for a system to be able to consistently try different paths automatically for you to try and get through to folks. Escalate if in the case of, maybe if it's a critical responder, for example, right? And you're unable to get through to them, how do you escalate to somebody else on the team? How do we reroute those messages so that we make sure we get the right responder on the team actually collaborating? And then, really thinking about with all your providers, which can be a big challenge, particularly those multimodal, right? Are you working with, as you think about, I guess what I would share is you think about systems that work across these, right? Certainly Everbridge does this, but we're not the only ones in the market that do this. We're doing things like working with partners to make sure there are backup SMS vendors, right? So if an SMS vendor goes down, how do you bring somebody else in, right? So working with organizations that also help to provide to make sure there's redundancy built into the system pretty much at all levels is key. And then that sort of individual continue to try and get a hold of people on different channels until you can get a hold of them. There's no foolproof system, right? That can cover all bases, but the more that you have, the more likely you are to get through. The other comment I would make is, sometimes this is about people and not just technology, right? So, for example, I know we have live operators, for example, that can pick up and run systems for you, and in some cases, we actually have people where we can put boots on the ground to help out, right? So those are all things to think about and explore as you think about protecting folks who are in the field and in your operations. So.
All right, thank you. Let's see here. Our next question. What are the typical events you see organizations planning for?
Yeah, another great question. I think many organizations think sort of along, many businesses in particular think along sort of two channels that we typically see. One is, the digital side, right? I'm sure everybody in the audience has critical digital infrastructure in place for keeps your business running. So, IT teams are often thinking about what are the things that can impact our digital services. Cyber attacks is certainly one that we often talk about there. But I think, with particularly if you have sort of a DevOps operation or something like that, thinking about change management, and even sort of what may be more daily types of events, but can still cause severe impact to your organization is one sort of pathway that we often talk about with customers. I think more on the physical side, many customers talk about weather events, and I would highlight that if you are thinking about, what are the hazards you should plan for, understanding the weather events that are likely to impact your organization is certainly key across the globe, wherever you may be located, and also thinking about one that, with the hybrid workforce, I think that extending those types of events to your traveling mobile workforce is now a key conversation that we have with many customers, because, as an organization, you have that duty of care that kind of extends out to those folks, but it can be very different to try and manage those events rather than just shutting down your facility. You may have a distributed team, and how does that big weather event now impact all of them? How do you bring that into play? So those are a couple that I would say are common, but it is a lengthy list, right? All the way from not only physical events and digital, but things like brand awareness events and kind of mitigating those as well.
All right, our next question. Let's see. What technology trends are you seeing around critical event management?
Yeah, a couple things to bring up there. I think one area that we see a lot of customers thinking through these days is as we think about the sort of the know part, right? How do you find out about things earlier? We have a lot of conversations with customers about that. And so the technology trend there really is, how can you bring in, risk information, risk intelligence events, et cetera, that can really help your organization, that's specific to your organization, that can help you mobilize and respond faster to events. So I think that's an area that many customers are thinking through. There are different, capabilities in the marketplace, obviously, but really that idea of getting that information quickly in a way that you can consume and respond, and bringing that outside knowledge into the organization is one technology trend, because often that's delivered, that's a technology type solution. The other area I would say is this idea of hyperautomation. Whereas, many organizations in their journey may be, just having people, for example, respond, right? So we're going to go out, we get our team activated, we may shut down a facility, right? And there may be, manual processes to that. But how do you hyperautomate and bring digital and physical systems into play? How do you shut doors, turn on cameras? How do you, change over control systems, for example, or reroute traffic? All those elements are really areas that I think a number of customers are exploring in order to speed up their ability to respond to events. So, and obviously a lot of that happens in the digital physical realm. And so understanding that kind of, ability to integrate with the various systems that you may have in place is certainly a key area that we talk about a lot.
All right, sorry about that. I was having issues unmuting.
No problem. Sorry.
Let's see here. I'm not sure, what kind of conflicts do you find between security and resilience? I'm not sure if that one is.
Yeah, interesting question. I don't know if there's I'm not sure we see as much of a conflict between security and resilience. Maybe a way, I'm not sure if this is exactly what is being asked in the question, is that, what I would say is that's similar to what we talked about with sort of the cross-organizational response, right? You do need a governance structure in place, right? Outside of technology for a second, and technology can certainly help support this, but you do need a governance structure that really is thinking longitudinally across the organization. And certainly in almost all corporations, right, over a certain size, security needs to play a key role in that process, right? So as we think about resilience, especially as we think about sort of the physical, there's sort of certain drivers here. I think I mentioned earlier, there's sort of the physical side of resilience, of protecting, et cetera. And certainly security plays a huge role in that in many organizations. And then there's the digital side, which typically has IT playing a role. And then we have other teams like HR and operations coming to the table as well. I think, a real key there is developing policies, procedures, governance structures that really bring the strength of all those teams to the resilience. Because at the end of the day, to be resilient, you really need the whole organization responding at sort of the highest level of quote unquote on that journey, right? It's the whole organization responding. So hopefully that addresses the question. I hope I caught it. But. Is there more there?
Oh, all right. I'm just kind of going over the screen and hopping around every time I click on one.
Sure.
This one may be interesting to hear your response. What do you think are the 3 biggest misconceptions about resilience?
Wow, interesting. Okay. Well, I would say I can pick one, which is, I think sometimes when we talk to customers, resilience is thought of as like the final state endpoint, right? Like at some point you will just be resilient. And I think one of the things we often have the conversation around is it is an ongoing process, right? You're always kind of moving down this path towards organizational resilience. It's not an endpoint. It's an ongoing process and engagement across the organization, which is one of the reasons that I highlighted this idea of you really need a cross-organizational governance structure and process cadence where you're meeting regularly, right? That team is working together over time to continue to ensure organizational resilience in general. That's probably the biggest one. I guess other misconceptions. I'll just say sometimes depending if the type of organization and experience, right? Folks might think it's enough that we have a binder with plan in it up on a shelf. I mean, while certainly that's key, right? You've had the discussion about what the plan is and all that good stuff. I think, that should probably be your starting point, not necessarily your end point in the preparation. And that can be a little challenging. Many times in those situations, it's also thought of as a single person problem, right? So, often we'll work with organizations where it's, we have a business continuity manager, it's the business continuity manager and the binders that they have. Again, that's really, it's a good key step, but it's the start, right, of the conversation. Shouldn't really be the end of the conversation, because it's not just that, while that person may bring expertise, it's not just that one person who's providing, right, who's managing the whole process. You need the whole team coming together. So those are a couple of thoughts that come to mind. Again, hopefully I'm providing some insightful feedback. So.
All right, thank you. Let's see here. Do you have advice for getting organization leadership buy-in to build out organizational resilience? Yeah,
so this is a really key question, I think, an important one. So I think one is, and it kind of goes back to kind of how we were talking about the framework here, right? So, I think you identify the types of events that could have the most impact on the business. And when you're having that conversation, from particularly in a corporate type environment, right? From an ROI perspective, right? What is the, I was giving some examples, for example, from the survey that we did, working with Forrester as part of this, and, showing the potential impact of, business interruption. And that might be business interruption. Again, your business may be very different. So I think understanding that potential impact is very important to senior leadership, right? It can be often difficult for them to get a good concrete grasp of the types of events and what real impact that it can have. We often, with almost all of our clients, depending on where they are in their journey, we often work on business value assessments with them and help them build that case, right? What are the key value points, depending on your type of organization? How do you present that back up? And then I think the second piece is the improvement piece, right? Being able to measure over time how well your team, how well the organization is now responding based on the investment the organization has made, is pretty significant. So thinking through, that's one of the reasons we highlight the improvement side as well. Not only does it help your team improve, but it will help you as you have those conversations with leadership. It will help you to help them understand the value of those and continue that journey within your organization of organizational resilience. So those are two key areas that I would highlight.
All right, thank you. And I'm just kind of reading some of these.
So
okay, here we go.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, do you think return on investment is easier to argue for security than for resilience?
Again, really good question. I think it depends on how you frame up the conversation with leadership, right? So, at least in my experience, the conversation often at a leadership level is what impact are you having on the business, right? Which is, revenue, costs, reputation, right? Those are the things that, again, depending on your organization, that the C-suite is thinking about. So I think aligning your goals to that is actually helpful. And I guess in some cases, I would almost suggest that talking about the resilience story can help, and I don't know if this is the question you're asking, but can help over a straight up security story, right? So if I'm running, again, it depends on the type of business, but if I'm running a large, high tech operation, for example, I might not immediately be grasping the value of, access controls and investment in cameras, et cetera, right? Up to a certain level, but I'm probably thinking about those as a cost infrastructure rather than positioning it as look, we're helping build resilience in the organization to mitigate these types of events that would happen. An example there might be an active assailant who comes in and what the impact not only on life would be, but what would impact be on the operation, right? So to give you an example there, I know we've done some studies around workplace violence, right? And what is the impact on the operations from workplace violence over time, turnover, et cetera. So thinking about it from that business value perspective, I think, which is tied probably closer to the resilience story, even though in this case, security would be providing the actual capabilities, might be a better path to go for justifying ROI or value versus, a cost center kind of value. So it's not an easy one. So I don't want to propose that it is, but that's typically the path that we talk about.
Okay, thanks so much, Eric. All right, so with that, we are going to begin to wrap up our conversation here. Now, there were some questions that were asked that we're not going to respond to today. However, I will be sharing them with Everbridge, and they will follow up with you directly. So, Eric, thank you so much for your time today in presenting, and thank you to Everbridge for sponsoring today's webinar. Now, to our attendees, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation as well. In a moment, when we conclude, you will be redirected to an evaluation. The evaluation takes less than 3 minutes to complete, so please share your thoughts about today's presentation. ASIS values your feedback as we look to schedule future programming. Lastly, completion of this webinar is eligible for 1 CPE credit. CPE credit will be updated directly into your user profile within 48 hours after the webinar's conclusion. Self-reporting is not required. Thank you again for attending today's presentation. You will now be redirected to the webinar evaluation.